Hi everyone. My name is Priyam, and as you know, I'm the econ tutor for your macroeconomics class. So I looked at your syllabus, and you guys will be spending the next 2 weeks on Chapter 11, Monetary Policy and the Fed. So I thought I'd go over like the first three sections of the chapter and kind of give you guys like an overview of what's going on. The first section is called Monetary Policy in the United States. And for this section, it's really helpful if you just do like a quick recap on like what exactly the Fed is and what it's supposed to be. So the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. And I believe every country in the world has like their own central bank. So like, for example, Japan has like the Bank of Japan. We have the Federal Reserve. And the three main goals of the Fed are as follows: low unemployment, to like maintain low unemployment as low as possible, to maintain stable inflation, which is to say not too much inflation, but not deflation either, just kind of like a Goldilocks level of inflation, like just right. And then the third one is to promote economic growth, which is like stable, healthy economic growth. So these goals are actually not mandated by the Federal Reserve Act, which established the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Act just kind of just gives an overview of what the Federal Reserve is. It doesn't actually state what it should be doing. It wasn't until a few decades later, until the Employment Act and the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act, that the Fed actually had like clear guidelines as to like what they should be trying to do. And those two laws, they passed like decades later, and they just kind of gave a more specific guidepost for like what the Fed should be doing. And that's how these three goals came into effect. So today, or sorry, no, tools that the Fed has at its disposal to achieve its goals are: one, that it can buy and sell government bonds through the open market. It can change the discount rate, and it can change the reserve requirement that banks are obligated to hold on to. So these are three tools that we talked about, I think, like a few weeks ago. I'm not really sure what chapter it was, but yeah, no, you could refer to like the other study sheets that I've created for you guys like in the past, and they go more in depth into like what these tools are and how the Fed uses them. So one example that I really wanted to go over, because it's kind of technical in your textbook, is how exactly the Fed uses these tools and what happens afterwards, because a lot of the times these three tools that the Fed has, they don't operate in isolation. If the Fed uses one tool to achieve, like let's say they use tool one to try to achieve like goal one, then usually that causes a chain reaction in other things, and that causes other factors in the economy to, other variables in the economy to change. So like it can be like a pretty complicated like cause and effect kind of thing. So I just wanted to go over like one example of how that might happen. So for example, if the United States economy is in a recession like panel A, then aggregate demand is not really meeting the long run aggregate supply. So basically the economy is out of whack, and the Fed will try to step in, and they'll try to boost spending and to boost GDP, to make sure that this line right here where my mouse is hovering, it moves all the way up here, and that way it'll be touching the aggregate supply curve. So that way the economy will move back to equilibrium. So one example of how the Fed can do that is that it will buy up more bonds to end the recession, and that increases the quantity of bonds demanded, like in panel B. But then in turn, that causes an increase in money supply, like in panel C. And then in panel D, you can see that that causes the exchange rate to increase, because all four of these charts are related to each other. And they all, like, if one thing happens in one chart, then it affects something else that happens in another chart, which is basically to say that the economy is connected in more ways than we can see, and affecting one thing here might affect something else over there. And there's really no way to kind of like control these kinds of things. They're just like variables that happen. But it is important to understand that the Fed, even though it has these tools at its disposal, they have to be really careful and very deliberate in how they go about doing these things because other things get affected. So another example is if there's high inflation, like in panel A. So for example, like if there's high inflation, aggregate demand will be up here, but they want it to come back down here where it'll touch the aggregate supply curve and then the economy will be back in equilibrium. So then the Fed will pursue contractionary policy and they will sell bonds instead of buying them. That will increase, that will increase the quantity of bonds supplied in the market. And then that in turn reduces the money supply, which ultimately increases the exchange rate in panel D. So yeah, like I said, like all these things are interconnected. And there are other variables, other factors that we aren't even accounting for in these four charts. Those variables would require their own charts, and then you can see how one change in one chart would affect something else in another. And you can do this for a lot of different types of variables all over the economy. And this happens like on a day-to-day basis, like on a constant basis. Basically, everything I wrote here is basically just like what I said, that these goals are not carried out in isolation and that everything, they're all just chain reactions. Okay, so moving on to 11.2, problems and controversies in monetary policy. So certain problems that are inherent in any policy making field is like the recognition lag and the implementation lag. So the recognition lag is basically the delay in realizing that there's something off about the economy and a policymaker from the Fed doing something to act on that problem. And then the implementation lag is just the time between when I, as like a Federal Reserve worker, policymaker, will pursue a policy, and then when that policy actually has a real effect on the economy. So those are just like inherent problems in the economy. Generally speaking, central banks like the Fed tend to do a better job when they're isolated from politics and when they can act independently, because politics has a way of kind of satisfying the short term need, whereas the Fed kind of has like the broader picture in their mind and they can act on the bigger picture. Liquidity traps occur when a change in monetary policy has no effect on interest rates. Quantitative easing is super important, and it's a Fed strategy that keeps interest rates low by keeping high levels of backup reserves for banks. This encourages banks to lend out more money and to stimulate the economy. The Fed has pursued a strategy of quantitative easing since the recession, and they only recently ended this strategy. So right now, the Fed is like in the process of raising interest rates, and that ultimately is like a signal that the strategy of quantitative easing is over, and that they're trying to like bring interest rates back to normal, because interest rates right now are like historically low for like big loans. So another strategy is credit easing that expands Fed lending to improve the credit market and to encourage liquidity, so that way people have more money to borrow. The rational expectations hypothesis is the idea that people use all available economic info to inform their decisions. This rarely ever happens because people are not rational as we think they should be. But that's just a human thing. So 11.3 is monetary policy and the equation of exchange. This is a lot of like basic algebra. It's basically the equation of exchange is basically just money supply multiplied by velocity of money, and that gives you the nominal GDP. The velocity of money is the number of times that the money supply has to be spent in order to buy up all the goods and services in an economy. So your textbook gives like a really basic example of like, let's say there's like you have a really basic economy on some like island remote somewhere, and they produce $50 worth of goods every year, but the money supply on that island is only $10. You would have to spend that $10 5 times in order to buy up all $50 worth of goods. So the velocity for that economy, that island, would be 5. For the US, I don't know what the velocity is, but yeah, it's basically just like all the money that we have, and how many times it needs to be spent in order to buy everything that we produce. So yeah, that's basically that. And then through like some manipulation of just like algebra, you can find that mv equals py. And these are just like variables that your textbook kind of gives you, but you can derive them through formulas and through well, these are the formulas, but you can derive them through like graphs and charts if you were to like visualize it. And then the quantity theory of money is basically just this idea that if the price level over the long run moves in proportion with changes, or sorry, the price level over the long run moves in proportion with changes in the money supply. This correlation is strongest in countries with high inflation, but it isn't as true in the short run. So that's basically it for this week. And next week, you guys will also be going over 11.2. So I think for that week, I'm just gonna like add more stuff for 11.3 because there's some other like mathematical stuff that I didn't really want to get into this week. But yeah, no, that's basically it for this week. And I hope that was helpful. And if you guys have any questions, you're always free to contact me. If not, I'll see you next week. Bye, guys.